Good morning, everyone. I'm Cindy Arnson, the director of the Wilson Center's Latin American program, and I'm very honored to be partnering today with the Ford Foundation and the Fundación Prisma and the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security program to discuss a really critically important subject, that of climate change in Central America and its impacts on livelihoods in the region and on migration to the United States. The Biden administration has pledged to address the root causes of migration from Central America's Northern Triangle. And indeed, in his platform as a candidate, Joe Biden pledged to, quote, develop a comprehensive four-year, $4 billion regional strategy to address factors driving migration from Central America. And the platform went on to note that the Northern Triangle faces enormous challenges from violence, transnational criminal organizations, poverty, and corrupt and ineffective public institutions. Then, scarcely a week after he took office, President Biden issued an executive order that stated that, quote, climate considerations shall be an essential element of United States foreign policy and national security, unquote. And indeed, just next week, President Biden will host a global climate summit that includes 8 countries from the Western Hemisphere, although none from Central America. So we're here today to connect the dots, to put the issue of climate change at the center of the policy discussion of Central America's challenges. And we could have no better reminder of the devastation wrought by climate change than the 2 monstrous hurricanes that hit Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua last November, destroying the homes and livelihoods of almost 7 million people. And now to introduce our distinguished speakers from Central America, along with the representatives of major international organizations. In some cases, people combine those 2 identities. I'm pleased to turn the program over to our moderator, Sarah Gamage. Sarah is the Director of Public Policy and Government Relations for Latin America of the Nature Conservancy. Thank you for joining us. Also, if you are interested in sending a question during the panel, please use the chat at the bottom of your screen or send a tweet to @LatAmprog, @LATAMPROG. Thank you.
Good morning, and it's really a pleasure to be able to co-host this panel this morning with the experts that we have to share their opinions and knowledge about climate change, migration, and the challenges of addressing those 2 key issues in the Northern Triangle. We will begin the presentation this morning with Omar Samayoa, a climate change specialist with the Inter-American Development Bank, followed by Adoniram Sanchez Perachi, who is the coordinator for the Mesoamerican region of the FAO, Ileana Monterosa, a scientist with the Center for International Forestry Research, and then Victor Lopez Illescas, a program officer for natural resources and climate at the Ford Foundation, and finally, Herman Rosa, a senior researcher at the Prisma Foundation. But before we begin the event, please choose translation if you need it. You'll see at the bottom of the Zoom, there's a globe. You can click on this and select the language that you would prefer to hear the presentations in. I'm going to remind the presenters that you have 8 minutes, and I will interrupt you and remind you when you have 1 minute left. Thank you so much. Please, Omar.
Good morning, everyone. I'm gonna do my presentation in Spanish, but the presentation is in English. Buenos días y muchas gracias por la...
Good morning, and thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this event. I'm Omar Samayoa. I'm a specialist on climate change of the Inter-American Development Bank, and I work precisely in these three countries of the Northern Triangle on things that have to do with climate change. Due to my time, I will go directly to my presentation. I will be discussing about the challenges that we have and then the opportunities that we have with the climate change in the region. And briefly, and I think that we all know about the vulnerability of the region to the climate change. So I would like to present some data about the economic impact that we have recently witnessed during the last 30 years. And these three countries have had the losses equivalent to $11 billion approximately, being the areas of infrastructure and agriculture, the sectors that have been the most affected ones. And this is what has happened recently. However, if we take a look into the future, the scenario of a climate change could be even more critical situation because there can be even stronger impacts, and not only economic impacts in these three countries if measures are not implemented to deal with this issue. Central America, in fact, is one of the most vulnerable regions worldwide, and it only compares to the south part of Asia in the degree of vulnerability. And briefly here we have some examples of how these impacts have taken place 6 or 7 years ago, more or less. We have strong events of droughts. This was evident, for example, in Honduras and El Salvador, with the appearance of some pests in Honduras, for example, a severe pest in a pine tree forest that affected the equivalent to 10% of the national forest of the country, which are 500,000 hectares with losses of almost $300 million. And the most concerning part of all this is that those affected areas were water basins, which is water used for electricity production, human consumption, and agriculture. And also the largest population of Honduras is in that area. In the case of El Salvador, we see the impact on coffee, which represents the most important crop of the country. And with a loss of economic losses of coffee was decreased almost to have between 2012 and 2216, the coffee extension that was reduced from 25 to 12%, and also employment decrease in this area. And recently, I can say that we have all heard about it, 2 hurricanes that hit the region that caused losses for more the $2.5 million in Honduras and El Salvador. And additionally to these phenomenon, we also now are facing the COVID pandemic. So this is a situation that causes more vulnerability in the region. The region is vulnerable already because of the climate change, but its vulnerability is increasing. And this accentuates also another issue, which is migration in these countries. Here we have different studies showing that in one specific area of these countries, which is called the dry corridor, which is very important because it represents almost 50% of the Northern Triangle, the main reason of migration or for food insecurity is the lack of money and jobs. These situations are related to climate change, and they are increasing because of climate change. So there's a strong link of climate change related also to some other problems, social problems, and they tend to increase due to the climate change, and that triggers also migration. The region also has opportunities, and this is the topic that we want to present: climate change and opportunities socio-economic development opportunities in the region. And here I want to mention the value chains of agroforestry. I'm talking here about value chains. The value chains have some specific characteristics that make them be specific, that allow to be more sustainable. First, and briefly to describe the agroforestry systems in the region. There are different kinds. We have crops like cardamom, coffee, cocoa, and many producers, and these are important crops. Like cardamom generates income for almost $648 million in Guatemala. Guatemala is #1 in cardamom producers. And when speaking about coffee, it generates income of 1.6 million. Cocoa, it's increasing, and another small scale livestock is also generating income in the region. So all these systems group many producers, and there's an opportunity in order to promote them at a scale and to promote the number of producers, or also to improve productivity and efficiency of the current producers. Many of them are not organized in chains, and they can use also organization in order to generate more jobs. And there are different characteristics that are key according to my point of view. And just briefly to conclude, I would like to say that all these chains have different characteristics, and I will move to my next slide. Strengthening organizations will give farmers resiliency, and also that will help markets to be better protected from outside shocks. And these are in rural areas where economic opportunities need to be generated, and to have a large number of producers. That will be very important to have resiliency in things that are related to water industry areas, and also protecting all of these public and private resources. And that is what we're doing in the bank. We have a portfolio of more than $200 million in 4 interventions aimed at this topic, and which are leveraging a similar amount of public and private funds. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, now we will continue with our next lecture. Mina.
Buenos días desde Panamá. Muchas gracias.
Good morning from Panama, and thank you for the invitation. I want to thank the Prisma Foundation and Wilson Center for inviting Val to talk about these reflections about the actions of the new Biden administration in its relationship to Central America, specifically Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. We are a United Nations agency specialized on topics of agriculture, nutrition, and climate change. We are present in all Central American countries with international staff that work on the different topics and provides technical assistance. And once more, we're very thankful for allowing us to make comments about the process that is taking place in the United States. I want to divide my comments into large areas. One is the emergency sense that we need to think about. It is an emergency because we as United Nations, we monitor and we inform to all the different countries of the system of the United Nations what is the status of what is hunger. And there are different methodological things that are followed, that online are identifying those people who have food insecurity or also a famish. And this decade, which is a very hard that the 3 countries went through, that Omar mentioned already, There were 6 years without crops because of droughts, 2 hurricanes, and now the pandemic and many other things. In agriculture, those that are in agriculture think and that they are more tended to have some diseases in these 2 years. For example, banana is very important to have a food security, and also the flying lobster that is eating everything which is produced in the region. So this sense of emergency in talking about starvation in those 3 countries, in Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, we have what we call phase 3 of food insecurity. These stage of food security are 5 stages and mechanisms that is known by all of those that work with humanitarian help. And phase 3 is characterized by these malnutrition and the capacity of the people to meet their needs of food. So this number in January of 2020 in these 3 countries, we have 3.4 million people malnourished. And that phase 3, in considering March of 2021, that is last month, right now is 7.1 million people. And in September, we expected that there will be 7.7 million people. And on phase 4, phase or stage 4 is even more severe. Something which is happening in Haiti, which is considered to be in stage 4. And they have been in a long time without food, and people are requiring for humanitarian assistance. In that stage 4, we didn't used to find it in Central American countries, but now we have 1.3 million in that area in stage 4. Stage 5 is total chaos. People die because of the famine. So we need to have actions that are impoverishing those areas in this area of these 3 countries. That means migration, social instability, and also the displacement of people. And the cooperation of the United States with the Latin American countries, there are many important and good things that can be strengthened. I will mention just 3 of them that are worthwhile mentioning right now and that will deal with large numbers. For example, all countries have school food programs for schools that is buying the food. For example, in Guatemala, that represents more than $40 million, buying from national agricultural producers, and many of the children, that is the only meal that they have at a cost of $1 per day. So these already helps to tackle these starvation. Also, as Omar has mentioned, we can see that climate change also impacts even more out of the countries that have been more affected by climate change. These 3 are part of the 15 ones worldwide. So we need to review the technologies of how to work in this dry corridor. Also, sometimes they don't have too much experience in irrigation systems that they will require. About zoning agriculture, they have some crops that are not viable anymore. So there is an agreement with NASA to have satellite photographs to see how agriculture is moving within the dry corridor area. And in that emergency, also remittances, I would say that 20% of the GDP of Guatemala and El Salvador depend of the remittances of people who are in the United States and send them to their country. And 80% are used for basic needs. And remittances show the cash transfer also and their functionality, that is that all countries have that, but with a very low financial capacity. on how to give those resources to people so that they can buy it for food, and also to have some community work done or to have an environmental agenda. So this emergency will be here with us for the next 4 or 5 years with very sad results. And my second comment is also something that Omar presented, and that is the opportunity to restructure the environmental agenda and the action of environmental funds in these three countries is something very interesting. It's interesting because, as Omar mentioned, a number of IDB, $600 million, and we as a FAO, we have a 250 that were increased. But if we have the World Bank, the Central American Bank of Integration in Central America, and we have a close to $1 billion in projects related to the assistance of this area. Why am I talking about large environmental projects? Because as in the Paris Summit, and the three countries that signed the agreement, they have commitments with their national contributions in order to contain climate change in 2 degrees, but it mixes 3 categories that help to face migration. First, the carbon economy, and also economic development, and 3 is social inclusion. These are projects that mix the economic, social, and environmental topics, and the financial amounts that allow to have things at a large scale.
E são projetos que arrastam um sistema de monitoreio.
And that requires a monitoring and reporting systems that are monitored by the Ministry of Ecology, and that financial platform is being operated to expand those relationships and to go to different communities and to bring in the private sector, and that will help us to have a real agenda. And these will be projects that will have 3 years and more than $500 million. The idea is how to expand that social environmental agenda of people who are part of these projects. Thank you very much for giving me these opportunities, Sarah. Ileana, please.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to Wilson Center for Foundation Prisma for the invitation to participate in this conversation. Today, I will share insights around how community-based forest management initiatives represent locally grounded solutions that can be scaled up to build more resilient societies. These insights draw on research from 2 CAR programs led by CIFOR together with local partners over more than 10 years on forest tenure reforms in the Global South. During this talk, I will argue that communities living in and around forests provide key lessons to transform this crisis and develop solutions based on sustainable resource use. So around the world, over 1.5 billion people live in and around forests and depend on them. In the Northern Triangle, forests remain an important source of livelihoods, and large portions of forests overlap with territories of indigenous peoples. In these landscapes, forests are critical to address the climate change agenda. They play a key role in mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, but they're also crucial for building adaptation, providing livelihoods, and enhancing resilience to crises, be they natural disasters, economic, or pandemic shocks. The challenge to promote transformation on the ground are huge in a region that is characterized by poverty and progressive environmental deterioration. Addressing underlying causes of social differentiation should be closely tied to actions that address the unequal distribution of control of natural resources, mainly land and water, and impacts affect rural, women, youth, indigenous, and poor groups more profoundly. The situation is aggravated as around 40% of the population still rely on natural resource-based activities for income and employment. Eta and Iota hurricanes are clear examples of the profound crisis. It affected over 4 million people in the region, displacing over 1 million, exacerbating food insecurity and chronic malnutrition, as you have heard from colleagues before me. These conditions are worsened by insecurity and weak governance, marked by increasing violence, corruption, and impunity. Under these circumstances, migration becomes a survival strategy as livelihoods deteriorate and concentration of resources displace entire communities, something we observed during the last migrant caravan, where over 7,000 people, mostly from Honduras, tried to flee these effects. Surprisingly, in the midst of these scenarios, two cases highlight opportunities and challenges around the role forests can play in strengthening governance and enhancing livelihoods, opportunities to address root causes of migration. The first case, the creation of community forest concessions within the Mayan Biosphere Reserve in Guatemala, represents a shift in government policy regarding land use and tenure, moving from a focus on agriculture towards a focus on conservation through sustainable use. This led to one of the largest certified forests managed collaboratively by communities, with important investments from the US government, who supported both institutional reforms and capacity building. Today, the community concessions are stewards and last bastion of the largest remnant of Guatemala, once vast forest of Petén. Recognizing community rights thus provides incentives for long-term community forest stewardship, increasing incomes, generating employment, and promoting new forms of investments. Organized communities patrol against forest fires and encroachment, shielding this area from increasing expansion of criminal activities. The deforestation rate is almost zero. By investing in capacity building, communities have established community forest enterprise, diversify activities, and obtain economic and environmental benefits. Forest management has become an important source of income, up to 60% for local communities. This is large in comparison to only 2% of families in these community forest enterprises reporting income from remittances. This shows forests provide income, employment, and keep people from being displaced and forced to emigrate. The community forest enterprises have helped to address social, economic, and governance challenges that neither the state nor the market were capable of addressing alone. Not only do communities pay taxes, but they also contribute to public services, health, and education in areas where the government institutions are mostly absent. They have become an important ally in strengthening the governance of protected areas.
Ileana, could you slow down just a little bit for the translators? Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. So initiatives to include forests are key components in development efforts. Have also promoted in Honduras. However, it has also been promoted in Honduras. The country has a long history of community forestry. However, threats over forests have been growing from corrupt and criminal interests. In the Mosquitia region, indigenous peoples have achieved titling in the past 10 years. Though that titling has been undermined by expansion of illicit activities and increasing influence of criminal organizations. Threats to modern-day Mosquitia are not unlike those that faced by community concessions when they were established almost 30 years ago. Lessons from community concessions show us that a stabilization of violent and chaotic territories is possible, where there is real investment in supporting community rights, and sustained effort is placed into reconciling the interest at local level. Just as USAID played a key role in supporting the community concessions in Guatemala, it can today play a key role in supporting more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable societies through aid to community rights and organizations. So what can be done? A number of short-term measures are within reach, focused on the largest forest areas and communities that are under threat from corruption, violence, and intense land pressures. These measures include supporting the renewal of community forest concession rights in the Mayan Biosphere Reserve, but also strengthening recently titled but besieged indigenous territorial councils in the Honduran Mosquitia. Any efforts to improve governance should strengthen institutions supporting territorial organizations, community forest enterprises, and indigenous territories. So going back to the initial question, is there a role for forests in addressing the root causes of migration in the Northern Triangle? These two cases in Honduras and Guatemala show the importance of understanding the role of land, forests, and natural resources in feeding problems of criminality, and by the same measure, recognize that securing rights and guaranteeing livelihoods is key for preventing corruption and building resilience. Challenges are not unsurmountable, and a roadmap to build resilience is possible, but it starts on the ground. It builds on the recognition of rights and strengthening partnerships with civil society and community organizations, including those that are today struggling to defend their lives, territories, and livelihoods against corruption, and are suffering the impacts of adverse climate conditions and government inaction. So while many factors are at play, 3 courses of action to build resilience and contribute to address the root causes of migration emerge. First,
Ileana, you have 1 minute. Thank you.
Thank you. First, investing in reform processes that recognize rights and strengthen land and resource governance institutions. Put right holders at the center and ensure processes are inclusive and equitable. Leave no one behind. Second, invest in capacity building, those capacities that support collective action and are tailored to the local context. And third, build resilience by guaranteeing options that enhance livelihood opportunities and allow for the scaling of resource-based solutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ileana. Victor, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks to the Wilson Center, to the fellow panelists, and to the audience participating today in this conversation on such relevant topics. As we have heard, the links between structural inequality, social exclusion, environmental degradation, and the massive problem of forced migration from the Northern Triangle of Central America to the US have been widely studied and debated, as well as the effects of the climate change that is a major root cause of the migration as well. We believe that there is at this moment a unique opportunity for the Biden administration to put in place effective and innovative policies to address the root causes of migration and the effects and the vulnerability of the region to climate change based in social inclusion. But what do we mean when we talk about social inclusion? We basically mean, as Ileana just mentioned, putting communities at the center of the design and the implementation of these policies. Across the region, many indigenous, Afro-descendant, and other local rural communities are crucial to the conservation of biodiversity, to the protection of key natural resources that are the material basis for people's livelihoods and for the national economies. But communities in reality are often the last consideration of any policy and program in terms of decision making and design. And why this happens? This happens mainly because international community interact with the national elites of the region. And these national elites are strongly linked to the practices of corruption, exclusion, racism, and a centralized vision of development. These elites also rely on systems of violence and impunity that allow them to continue enriching while the nature continues to be destroyed and the peoples continues to be impoverished. I will now unpack 3 core policy priorities that we consider show how to significantly innovate in terms of social inclusion. I will mention first the need to increase support to local institutions. I will mention second, the need to improve the mechanism for the protection of life and collective rights of indigenous peoples. And third, I will mention the need to implement more respectful and effective consultation systems. Coming to the first, we clearly see the need to continue improving the way institutions understand, provide formal recognition and support to the local institutions that the communities use to make decisions and to integrate from the local to the national and regional levels. We already heard the successful case that Ileana mentioned in the Mayan biosphere in northern Guatemala. Why this case is successful? Well, the main factor is that the communities from the beginning of that model of community forest concessions are in the center of the decision making. They are not in the center because anyone granted them easily that position. They struggled hardly, and gladly they had continued support along the years from, in one side, the National Authority for Protected Areas, the CONAP of Guatemala, and on the other side, the international communities, where, for example, the USAID had played a crucial role to support these communities, along with many other NGOs and bilateral organisms. These communities of Petén have achieved 25 years later a balanced combination of inclusive rural development, as Ileana showed, and protection and conservation of biodiversity. At this moment, they are contributing to the national goals for mitigation of climate change. And the model of these communities at the center can be used in the climate policies, for example, to restore lands in community-based schemes, and to manage challenges, for example, the agriculture insurance challenges that some members of the audience are asking about. Well, second, the need of improving the mechanisms for the protection of life and the collective rights of indigenous peoples. I will mention another example, a challenging one, that is the Garifuna community along the northern coast of Honduras. The Garifuna people during this pandemic context have deployed a commendable set of collective measures aiming to support the most vulnerable families and people from the pandemic, combining ancestral knowledge and modern practices of healthcare and preventive care. But rather than having support from the Honduran government, these Garifuna communities continues to be attacked, criminalized, and even their leaders being killed. At this moment, the Ofrane, the main institution of the Garifuna people, is claiming both nationally and internationally the search of 5 missing leaders that were kidnapped last July because of defending their territory and their lands, and are still missing, and they have received virtually not any effective support from Honduran government and judiciary organisms. This is coherent with the reality that shows the annual reports of the British NGO Global Witness that show us that in the region we have 3 countries, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua, among the 10 deadliest countries for land and environmental defenders. This relies on the systems of violence and impunity I already mentioned. I will go third to the need of implementing respectful, effective consultation mechanisms. Consultation and, sorry.
1 minute, thank you.
Consultation, thanks, and free prior informed consent are collective rights of indigenous people, but so far governments have neglected, as well as the companies that governments delegate or grant concessions to deploy investments, have neglected, blocked, and criticized the consultation mechanisms. But these mechanisms can evolve into permanent dialogue system between communities and governments. We have some good examples with indigenous communities and local authorities having agreements with some governmental agencies, such as the Public Ministry in Guatemala, sharing administration of justice with some indigenous people, such as the Ixil, the Chortí, the Cachiquel. Having, for example, Chuarrancho municipality in the Guatemala city capital, one of the most violent cities in the world, with almost 0 criminality and 0 homicides rates. That's because indigenous authorities assuming responsibilities. I will stop here, affirming that the only opportunity for climate effective policies is around putting communities at the center of decision making from the very earliest stage and definition moments of policies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victor. Herman, por favor, adelante.
Good morning. On behalf of PRISMA, a think tank focusing on the critical linkages between environment and development in Central America, and I thank the Wilson Center and the Ford Foundation for co-sponsoring this event. And I also thank the previous panelists for covering so much ground. This Wednesday, climate change was front and center in Washington. In the roundtable that Vice President Harris had with US experts on the Northern Triangle, and in the House Foreign Affairs Committee hearing on renewing the US commitment to addressing the root causes of migration from Central America. President Biden has stressed that addressing the climate crisis is at the heart of his foreign policy, and the Northern Triangle will be a test case for that commitment. Therefore, we can expect an ambitious climate resilience component within the 5-year strategy for the Northern Triangle, requested by Congress in the United States Northern Triangle Enhanced Engagement Act that was enacted at the end of last year. Thus, that strategy is being drafted as we speak. And I will outline 4 critical lines of support that we believe should be included in that strategy to build climate resilience in the Northern Triangle. First, the support of large-scale restoration of agricultural landscape managed by small farmers to address land degradation that covers millions of hectares across the Northern Triangle. This extensive land degradation is a major source of vulnerability, climate risk, and food and water insecurity. It has economy-wide impacts through the destruction of infrastructure when we have extreme precipitation events. Urban areas also experience water scarcity in the dry season. Conservation agriculture practices to reduce land degradation are well known, and hundreds of experiences across the region prove their effectiveness and benefits. However, adoption of these practices at scale is low, among other reasons due to the large initial labor demands. Therefore, substantial external support is needed to facilitate adoption at scale. Second, it is vital to support forest stewardship by indigenous peoples and local communities. Previous speakers provided the rationale for this support. Third, the support for the restoration of other ecosystems critical for risk reduction and climate resilience, such as riparian forests along riverbanks that are disappearing and mangroves that sustain wild fisheries and the livelihoods of many coastal communities. Community-based ecological mangrove restoration drive can restore their health while generating significant employment. A drive to restore riparian forests as well can also encourage the political will to enforce regulations and implement other actions to protect and expand those areas. Fourth, the support for urban climate risk reduction and ecosystem rehabilitation. Many settlements in cities, towns, and villages across the Northern Triangle live in fear of landslides and flash flooding triggered by extreme precipitation. Most urban rivers are sewage channels and waste dumps, threatening the health of the marginal communities that live along their banks. These risks can be reduced by focused interventions with well-known techniques that are rarely implemented due to their labor-intensive nature. Together, these 4 lines of support represent an ambitious but desperately needed measured initiative to build the green infrastructure required to advance climate resilient development in the Northern Triangle. Being labor intensive, this initiative would create hundreds of thousands of jobs, but it is also essential to build a strong social fabric, the social infrastructure that is also fundamental for inclusive climate resilient development. As we know, the social fabric in the Northern Triangle was weak to start with, but has been further torn apart in the last decades, thus nurturing violent and criminal behavior. Obviously, this massive endeavor requires sufficient resources to really make a difference, but also the full engagement and commitment of local and civil society organizations, as well as other actors in the Northern Triangle. We are used to spending billions of dollars in building great infrastructure, under the premise that those investments will lead to high economic growth and higher incomes. We have done that for decades, and the results are not encouraging. Therefore, it makes sense to focus large investments in building the green and social infrastructure that directly benefits the most vulnerable and that can sustain inclusive and climate resilient development. In that regard, the Biden administration should commit at least $2 billion for this climate initiative. Given the extremely high social, economic, and environmental returns that can be expected, $2 billion is a modest and initial down payment that can go a long way in addressing some of the persistent driver factors of migration, thus also giving people hope, as well as concrete options that can make it worthwhile to stay at home in Central America rather than take the dangerous trek to the United States. Thank you very much. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Herman. Perfect timing. Well, I'm going to take the opportunity as moderator to ask a couple of questions while we collate the questions from the audience. And I'm going to begin with a question about a little more nuance in the discussion of resilience and livelihoods. I think the panelists have played out incredibly well how outmigration responds to food insecurity, the collapse of livelihoods, the loss of employment, and the failure to generate decent and dignified work. But can we talk a little bit more deeply to the types of livelihoods, interventions that secure resilience, and to whom benefits? Can we sort of break out a little bit more men and women, youth, indigenous peoples? What kinds of approaches do we need to be thinking about that enhance livelihoods for different groups and across those value chains? Please feel free to unmute yourself and respond.
Sarah, if I may, and just going back to some of the issues that I was sharing with all of you, I think, we need to start with rights. I mean, unless youth, women, indigenous peoples are considered and respected as right holders, and that's not only, to bring them to the table to participate, but actually, ensuring they have the assets, they have the capacities to be able to engage in decision making. That for me, it's a key part of the process to get the conversation and actually the resilience process for those groups in particular. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Sara, ¿puedo?
Sarah, can I take the floor? Sí, por favor. It's about the indigenous people. There is a lot of potential. All the maps we work with, satellite maps of deforestation in the region, they clearly showed and those indigenous lands are better preserved. So there is some livestock in that area, but is not well recorded or registered. NDCs, which NDCs are the goals of those countries that were registered before the climate summit, and that moves the different projects. And there are many things that need to be done, but none of these countries, as a part of their millennium measures, have set a specific plan. For example, Costa Rica just received, because of the results that it has obtained as part of the commitment, but it generated more carbon. It receives almost $6 million a year to be used in their environmental economy, because it was expected that the carbon market would be working, but it didn't work in the last 30 years. Now we have all that literature. So they hope that they will be able to make visible all the indigenous practices that they have had.
Thank you.
Can I please chime in? Thanks, and I agree with Ileana and Adoniram, and I can also say that, of course, it's challenging to try to improve livelihoods at the scale using the best practices and the best cases, and as a rapid response when we have thousands of people migrating. But at the same time, the region have a lot of good examples that can be used and scaled up gradually. For example, indigenous people such as the Quechua people in the Alta Verapaz side in Guatemala, and others that are approaching to diversification of agroforest and agriculture systems, reaching local markets, and participating more in the value chains. For example, the value chains that Omar mentioned. Most of them so far lack of have the problem of producers with very, very low participation. But these examples can be gradually scaled up across the region, but having in mind that local institutions are the one that can make that possible. Also, as someone was asking in the chat, the way to address the agriculture insurance problem, I think Omar will expand on that. Mostly should rely on local and collective mechanisms, because it's impossible to handle such a high risk insurance areas on individual and company-led basis. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Please.
Just to add up on what my colleagues have mentioned, I want to refer to the case that Victor is talking about. There is a lot of expertise of cases that have been developed by different communities, by indigenous peoples to improve livelihood. So if we have an inventory of the region, we will see the amount of experience that we have in there. And the key to expand that would be to have a structure that will make it sustainable. And based on my opinion, the organization is crucial. All the success cases, and there are many of them in the region, and we can dwell on that, but all successful cases, they all have good organizations that make those interventions to be sustainable. That is important to bear in mind if we want to scale up this at the region level.
Thank you, Omar. I think I'm going to transition now to
allow me, Sarah, just a brief comment.
Please, adelante.
I think in our proposal, livelihood security is at the heart of the proposal. Just two examples. Well, you yourself know very well the case of mangrove forests. They are one of the most productive ecosystems on Earth and are vital for the livelihood of these coastal communities. So the degradation has a direct impact on those livelihoods, and the rehabilitation obviously would have also a huge positive impact. On land degradation, for instance, in the first the case of the support to reverse the land degradation, in the west, just in the western highlands of Guatemala, we have about 1.5 million hectares that are highly degraded. We know that that area is also one of the main sources of migration to the United States. So normally, most projects leave out the most degraded areas because you don't get there the economic returns that most projects demand. But it's precisely those areas that we insist should be targeted, because these are the areas where livelihoods have been broken up. And that is where those areas where livelihoods need to be reestablished and strengthened. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Herman. So really building on this, we've had several questions in the chat about financial access. A lot of the regenerative practices, a lot of the adaptive practices that can help respond to the urgency of improving, increasing resilience require financial resources and labor. So how can we ensure that we're not just doing many little projects, but we're really building an opportunity to engage in regenerative practices and adaptive management at scale? How can we channel resources to farmers and to smallholders and to local communities in their endeavors? Particularly in the case where the system, the financial system itself, is not forthcoming, they don't have collateral. How can they get access to loans? How do you see the opportunities to really increase financing for many of these activities for the different groups?
Sara, ¿puedo empezar?
Sarah, can I start?
Creo que es una pregunta.
I think this is a very important question. I would start by saying that in the region, there are many resources. I don't see that funding is an issue. And there are many resources from the private sector. By private sector in general terms, specifically, I can say that there is the microfinance sector, which is important. Microfinances has many tools to deal with or to work with this kind of groups. There are different questions related on how can we do to work with one sector that has no collateral, on how to provide a low-cost credit. Within the build group, we have been working on this topic, and we are implementing tools like a collateral fund to decrease the risk. But I go back once more. For these to work, funding is not the problem, but for these to work, we needed to have a baseline and to have groups with sound organization. Otherwise, funding, instead of being a solution, it will become a problem. There are different ways to decrease the funding cost. Basically, is to decrease the risk. We can do it with a collateral fund, but also we need to have some other tools such as technical assistance for the banking system to be knowledgeable about these sectors, and that can be solved. But once more, what I consider is that we need to have a sound structured organization for these to be successful.
Sarah, I think there are three critical elements here. First, I think we just have to abandon the 3-4 year project mindset. This requires a sustained effort over time. In the case of landscape restoration, we're talking that we need to sustain effort for at least 1 or 2 decades. So this requires like a different approach. It's about building territory. It's about building territorial governance. And advancing a process that accumulates over time. Obviously, this is a highly intensive labor effort. But I think that is precisely the advantage that we have in the context of our discussion, which is how do we deal with the driving factors, with the root causes of migration? Because by generating massive employment, we begin to give people opportunities, even in the case of agriculture, for those that do not have any land access or are extremely land poor. So I think, I do think, and I have a different take from Omar, that we do need substantial resources, because whatever existing resources there are, do not target those areas that need the most support, and do not target those populations, those communities that are really the most vulnerable.
Thank you so much. Victor, please.
Gracias. And I will take this in Spanish. Gracias. Quiero.
Thank you. And I want to build on what Herman is answering, and also because there are different questions related on how we can really create models that will have these communities at the center and will make them to be scalable. Amalia has mentioned, for example, that the only references of national efforts have taken place just by saying that there is a lack of political will, for example. So how can we scale it up, or what are the opportunities that we have nationally? I think that civil society in the Central American countries is strong. It has accumulated knowledge, but precisely has been facing a constant attack that hasn't allowed it to be integrated at a national and regional level. However, there are wonderful examples. I am from Guatemala, and I am proud to say how indigenous local authorities are growing more and more in their capacity to be federated. They have great success in the area of justice, for example, but yes, we're lacking mechanisms that will be an incentive for that integration, and also mechanisms that will allow for that growth to be harmonious and that will not end in concentration of power or corruption practices, which are so well known in the region. There is where we consider that there is a specific opportunity right now to use an incentive for those mechanisms that will allow to have that integration in parallel by increasing the participation of producers in value chains, and to gradually expand the restoration processes of lands and degraded land that Herman just mentioned. Thank you very much.
Sarah, I just wanted to say, like not only about we do have lessons on, what makes an inclusive business model, especially, like working around value chains and understanding the different roles that the actors that are involved play within those value chains, and also identifying the type of barriers they face. So, like it's not the same if we're talking about an organization at the collective level, and whether we're talking about indigenous women within that organization. That's key. That's very important to look, especially where we want to expand the work of value chains and actually promote inclusive business models. But going back to the comment from Victor, I would say, like it's very important to work at scales. Like we need to start working at a territorial level. And from the cases that we shared today, there are experiences of things that are happening on the ground at the territorial level that allows to start scaling out on the mobilization, but also on the positive experiences, and also, from the lessons learned. And of course, talking about the challenges faced in the lowlands is not the same, and those faced in the highlands versus what's going on in the urban areas. So trying to organize and support those processes on the ground would be key to be able to scale efforts in this process. Thank you, Sarah.
Sarah, can I?
Please.
É certo que o tema financiamento.
It is true that funding is crucial, and I would say if the private financial system is not participating, then we have many good experiences in cocoa, coffee, and also these potential that has been identified, but the limit today is technological innovation in those projects to be scaled up and for them to be differentiated. And then to have the participation of the financial private sector and return rates and payment capacity are complicated things to be dealt with. We just carried out a study with the Central American Bank in Central America because we have a project and that we're in the last stage on how to have a mix of what Omar was talking about, having sovereign debt, climate fund, and grants to look for that client. And we're talking to women, indigenous, and youth that they have problem by having a collateral and to formalize the tenure of their lands. And the private appetite is not too big. Usually they're used for soy, for corn, and all the technology that they use basically is for those kind of crops, or even for a watermelon or a pineapple. And so I agree with Omar that we need to talk, yes, about the collateral systems, and in order to give comfort to the operators to look for this client. Right now in Central America, in the coffee operation, they operate at 8 or 11%, and it is expensive to have a credit and to use that credit to work for 2 or 4 hectares, for example.
Have really focused on the kinds of organization that is required and the types of decentralization. And I think it's really powerful to look at the argumentation about how do we have governance, territorial governance that we can reinforce through these initiatives. But I think that also means we need greater decentralization and decentralization of budgets. Can you describe a little more about what kinds of spaces do we need to create to ensure that we put local communities, indigenous peoples at the center of these policies and their implementation, and what needs to change in terms of the governance structures and support for those structures to do that well?
If I can start the conversation, like that's, we do have the Central America and Latin America, has gone over more than 30 years of their centralization process, right? We're new to this, but we're also not new to the challenges of how do we go about doing that, In the case of Central America in particular, and I think not only in the chat, but also previously colleagues have also shared the importance of, focusing on enforcing the social mobilization and the local organizations. But, I also think that needs to be tied and to be enforced by partnerships, like partnerships within civil society organizations, partnerships between those organizations and the state, partnerships between the state and the private sector and the communities. And we do have some ongoing efforts, like we do have some examples of how that has been tied to sectorial issues, even within climate change. Look around the number of tables or round tables that were created to discuss climate change issues. But like looking around what has worked within those spaces, what actually has not. We have also observed, the type of barriers that these groups are facing to be able to engage in those more actively. So I think, it's important we're not starting from scratch to look at the lessons learned on those processes. We know what are some of the barriers that these groups are facing, not only to participate in multi-stakeholder forums, but also, in access to credit, in value chains. We need to start, highlighting those barriers that refer to access to assets, to access to decision-making spaces, to enhance capacities, to make sure that we're able to scale out those processes. So yeah, those would be my ideas for that. Thank you.
Sara.
Please.
Creo que en este tema la
I believe that the participation of local actor is key in order to achieve that decentralization. In the region, we have an entire baseline of institutions and legal baseline. That is not a barrier. I would say that we need to engage these actors, especially local governments, municipalities, mayors. That is key. because they play a strategic role in the territory and they need to be our allies. We have developed successful cases where we have the participation of mayors that has moved the agenda, and local leaders or local organizations, they are the ones that need to lead the process. And many times we as a cooperation, we want to be at the front, but I think that's a mistake. We need to be behind them, supporting them, and we need for them to own the agenda. And if that is achieved, then we will be able to face and to have changes.
Anyone
Eh,
else? Please.
yeah. Quiero seguir sobre esa
I
línea.
would like to make a follow-up comment. I think there's an important challenge on the pace and based on the framework of time on how these projects are set. As it has been mentioned, there are available funds, but usually the terms for the execution of programs and projects do not allow to strengthen these institutional power of these local institutions to take place in parallel. Yes, the more successful our mayors, more likelihood for them to be replaced and not to be reelected, for example. That is a complex cycle that we have that is taking place in the region, because unfortunately election systems and they are funding campaigns, and this is linked to corruption practices of the region. The less corrupt have less possibilities to stay with these successful experiences in the power. So I think that one of the solutions would be that multi-actor experiences to be able to transfer not only the discourse, but programs, resources, and decisions at a local level. We have examples in the region, like the debt transfer programs, for example, that have been successful to include multi-actor decision-making systems where institutions gradually are integrated and the municipalities and the academia participate and the private sector and the government participate. But we haven't been able to transfer this at a territorial level. So decentralization, as Ileana said, there is a lot of experience, but it's not balanced. And there is decentralization, but there is taking place at a very slow pace, and decentralization of corrupt practices, but there is not decentralizations of a check and balances that will allow to overcome this problem.
Thank you, Victor. Herman. You're on mute, Herman.
Yo creo que esto también nos lleva al tema de
I
cuáles
think
son
that
los
these
mecanismos.
leads us as well to the topic of which are the mechanisms. If this is our premise that we need to have a processes that need to be sustainable through time, much more than the traditional time specific of projects, we also need to consider which are the financial mechanisms to support these processes. And I think that here we have the opportunity to think of a new climate funds as an option, because that allows also for the international community to feed these funds without having the concern that it need to guarantee results in only 3 or 4 years. And the key is, and here we have 3 key elements. First, how these funds are managed. I think that experience shows us that even though it is convenient to have the participation of governments within these funds, but they should not be controlling those funds. Funds control should be having a combination, local actors, the academia, different groups, and also with all the required safeguards to avoid the conflicts of interest. And obviously, we need to have clear rules, transparent rules to have access to those resources, and also the capacity to be able to support projects and initiatives at very low scale. I think that there are different experiences in the world that show this is possible. So I believe that these funds that are deeply rooted, I think that they will have a better capacity to support these processes to make them sustainable in time. And during 10 or 20 years, I think that this is a route that we need to explore, and probably to consider it before the financial crisis and the tax crisis that we're facing, and probably to have a new project to have the transfer of that government debt could also be another route to be able to work better with these funds. Just 1 minute. Here we're talking a lot about projects, but the numbers and to customize and to be able to achieve those 2 degrees according to the Paris Summit, we see that most of the efforts or resources, come from a national fund. For example, the Minister of the Economy, of the Environment of El Salvador, these are new structures in our area. So we are creating these institutions that are open, transparent, social participation, because many times we talk about international cooperation, but it is limited. We do not only work with international funds. It is important to have this based on this social participation, good governance measures, local at a local level.
So I'm just going to go back to the discussion of fiscal space. It's clear that nature-based solutions can be critical in addressing climate change, in promoting resilience, in improving regenerative practices. But we need fiscal space. We need investment in this at scale across the Northern Triangle. Now, individual markets don't reward regenerative practices. We're in a highly commoditized sector. Coffee, cacao, the commodities that we discussed in the value chains, the prices are just not sufficient to be able to compensate for the kinds of regenerative practices that would be need to put in place. So what are our options for increasing fiscal space? Can we reverse some of the perverse subsidies that go towards agriculture that increase the sort of intensive use of pesticides or that subsidize practices that are not regenerative? Can you sort of think about what are the options that we have to be both create fiscal space to invest in nature-based solutions, or support markets in ways, or support farmers in ways that compensate them for those regenerative practices?
Sarah, I think here there is a big role for the IMF and the World Bank, particularly in these times of the COVID pandemic and what will come afterwards. The fiscal space has shrunk tremendously. Public debt has skyrocketed. Public deficits as well. So I think this opens the opportunity for a serious engagement, because short-term political considerations often lead to directing resources to programs that have very little impact. But I think given the need of the countries to access concessional financing, and the possibility to also reduce the debt burden through debt swaps, I think opens the opportunity for a serious policy dialogue, coordinated policy dialogue between the IMF, the World Bank, the United States government, that through the Treasury has such a huge influence in those institutions, no? To make sure that public budgets and sectoral policies begin to take very seriously into account climate resilience considerations. So I think it's not so much about opening the fiscal space, but rather making sure that the framework to advance climate resilience is seriously taken into account, because the situation we have so far, we have extraordinary proposals in Central America, but there is no political commitment to implement them. Whatever is being implemented is because external donors are supporting those efforts. And pretty much on the margins of the public policy framework, or even in opposition to it. So I think we have an extraordinary opportunity to change those dynamics.
Sara.
Please, thank you. Thank you.
Yo creo que hay tres.
I believe that there are three important funding sources to support solutions based on nature. First, and probably the most obvious ones, are international funding, specifically climate funds, which is not the largest part. No, those funds are as a catalyst. And then we have public resources. And here, just to underline what we just heard by Herman, and they have limited fiscal spaces. It's hard for them to assign more resources for this. The good news is that we need to explore within what countries already have, because there are many resources that have that approach, but sometimes they are not necessarily used in the most efficient way. I was surprised by a data made in a presentation where it was mentioned that the largest investment in payment for environmental services in the region come from the Ministry of Agriculture, which is the opposite of what we can think of. So we have important resources that can be channeled in the best way possible to make them more efficient. And there are some others for forestry incentives in Guatemala, for example. They are allocating $75 or $100 million into this topic. And finally, resources. We have different ways to explore resources of markets specific that value this kind of products. For example, right now there's a strong trend, especially for this kind of organizations, a fair markets that value environmental services, etc. So that can be further explored, and also to once more look for all these actors of the private sector. And here, this is in general, and here I'm speaking about also microfinances, and there are different co-ops that are supporting this kind of producers, and that they are assisting to provide these solutions based in nature.
If I can add to that, and drawing from a question from the chat about, focusing more on the how and not so much on the what. I think, and drawing also from the discussion of fiscal issues, I think the US and the Biden administration, it's in a very good position to support ongoing reforms, starting with fiscal reforms, like US government is in a unique position to influence powerful actors that sometimes oppose changes and promote a more inclusive process of how reforms happen. Ensure that the funds that are going to be channeled through the US government are focusing on multi-sector and multi-stakeholder processes, focusing on those that are already in place, looking at those that are actually working. And last, I would say, like we need to invest at the landscape or territorial level. It will allow us to be more targeted in terms of the key issues, finance, organization, institutional reforms that are tailored to the context, which I think is really important. Over back to you.
Thank you. Please,
just briefly to add on that, not only fiscal reform, which is very important, should be supported, but also the struggle against corruption and the impunity that allows the corruption to continue to be a normal practice in our countries at all levels. I must say, someone asked about the risks of corruption and of local officials, and the corruption is a spread practice across the territories in the region, but it is possible because it remains in impunity so far. So the Biden administration have a strong opportunity to support the national endeavors. You have the CCS in El Salvador, in Guatemala. No one thinks that we can have a CICIG again, but we have national, very, very commendable efforts led by the prosecutor against impunity and corruption. And these efforts should be supported, but not only in their operations, but in the way they are more rooted in civil society and society in general, in dominant narratives, and in many other ways that will reinforce the idea of using the national resources that Omar mentioned. For example, there are resources, but the amount of funds being lost because of corruption are incredible, but and is preventing the initiatives to be effective.
Thank you so much. Well, mindful of the time, I think I'm going to ask each of you to say one point that you really want to communicate that you feel that should be included in a much more holistic and integrated climate resilient focus for the Northern Triangle. Please, Omar.
Gracias, Sara.
Thank you, Sarah. I would like to leave you with one last comment. This is a complex topic, as we have mentioned, and it is important to look for synergies. Unilateral efforts on climate change or in migration or economy, they can hardly solve a problem that needs to have an integrated management. We needed to have teamwork, having the participation of governments, international cooperation, private sector, and of course, local actors that we have widely mentioned here as the core in all these area in order to solve a problem which requires an important scale. We say that we need to generate jobs. The amount of people in these territories is a large number. This is a huge task, but it's not impossible based on my point of view. And if we work all together in a relatively short term, I think that we can provide better solutions in the region.
Primero agradecer nuevamente la oportunidad de reflexionar. Yo vuelvo a insistir el tema de las emergencias. Ese tema de la migración volverá con mucha fuerza en 2021. Ya se está iniciando otra vez el movimiento de caravana. Entonces, mucha atención con el corredor seco, que de ahí que está saliendo más de 50-55% de las personas por una falencia brutal del sistema económico, ¿no? Entonces, ese foco com medidas de emergência e, como disse Omar, também de aumento de resiliência, é uma boa mirada. Câmbio.
Gracias. Eliana, por favor.
Gracias. Voy a terminar en español.
Thank you. I think that the U.S. government has a key opportunity to support those who are not always being well represented. Women, youth, indigenous peoples, the ones that are suffering with a climate change and also the impacts of corruption, impunity, and violence. So my message will be to be focused in promoting rights for those who are not represented in the political processes of the region. Victor?
Thanks. It's been great. I would like to affirm that there is a lot of opportunities for innovation in terms of social inclusion and social technology. During the last year, even the rural grassroots groups are coming to innovate in terms of making decisions on a remote and online basis and so on. There is a lot of potential in the region. And we believe that putting communities in the center, as I said, is possible. And the Biden administration have a particular opportunity to support that. And thanks to the audience that have been very, very active with valuable ideas and questions, and hopefully we will be able to address them. And our contact data is in the website of the Wilson Center. Thanks.
Thank you, Victor. Herman.
I think these are exciting times. I think it's the first time we have a US administration putting climate center at the center. And there is a bipartisan agreement that the root causes of migration has to be dealt with in the Northern Triangle. So I think this gives a big opportunity to use the Northern Triangle as a laboratory, small-scale laboratory of how you can effectively build climate resilience. I mean, and I think that can be a good contribution globally. And I'm very optimistic that we can move along those lines. Thank you.
Thank you, Herman. Cindy, I'm passing the word back to you to close us up. Thank you so much.
Great, Sarah, thank you so much. And thanks so much to our panelists who are obviously doing so much on the ground and from the international community to support communities and people that are struggling with the impacts of climate change so directly in their lives. I'd just also like to thank our audience for the very active chat. We will try to download all of the comments and make them available. The PowerPoint presentations will also be on the event page. So thank you again to the panelists, to our co-sponsors, the Ford Foundation and Prisma, and to everyone who's joined for this very important conversation. And we will continue to make efforts to make sure that these considerations are included in the way the Biden administration addresses the root causes of migration from Central America. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Sarah, Cindy, and all.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Yes.
Bye.